Well, the clock is certainly ticking, and I think it is true that phase two is going to be harder. I mean, the UK cannot expect to have as good a deal in terms of trading relationships as it has as a member of the European Union, the single market and the customs union. And there are going to be some difficult issues. I mean, perhaps not so much over goods, but certainly over services, and particularly over financial services, which from a UK perspective represent a particularly crucial area of the negotiations.
I'd like to ask you a bit about of the deal that came about last week that indeed allowed this phase one, if you will, to come to an end. How it outlined the divorce, but really with few details. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think there are a few details, and in some respects, some of the things that are in that document represent something of a fudge in order to enable the second phase of negotiation to proceed. I mean, it's still not really clear how the question of Ireland is going to be settled, how this question of avoiding a hard border in Ireland is going to be resolved. That's going to be very difficult. I mean, OK, one way one can proceed is trying to have as much regulatory alignment with the single market as possible, but then that raises all sorts of concerns in the minds of Brexiteers, because they then wonder what are they getting out of this deal in terms of leaving the European Union, supposedly getting more regulatory freedom.
Indeed. Will this topic, Irish border, will it haunt the talks, as it is essentially impossible for Britain to leave the bloc's single market while avoiding a hard border in Ireland?
Well, it's very difficult to see what the way is out of this situation, and of course it's made even more complicated by the fact that the government in London is dependent on the Democratic Unionists for their majority, and there are simply, you know, if someone had an easy solution to this problem, they would have come up with it by now. And if Britain remained in the single market with the customs union, of course that would be a solution, but politically that's not a feasible way forward.
Well, so then we've got the British Prime Minister getting the support she needed to see from Brussels. But what about back home in London? How much support does she have among MPs? Of course, she just faced a parliamentary defeat this week.
Yeah, and of course she could face another defeat next week on this question of having the actual date of leaving the European Union in the legislation. I mean, it has to be said, I think what happened earlier in the week was not very well managed by the whips. It might have been possible to avoid that defeat if, in fact, more concessions had been made at an earlier stage. As it happened, there was a very minimal concession at a very late stage. And, of course, the other thing that happened is that Labour Brexiteers didn't support the government in the numbers that they usually do.
Well, let's say indeed that she does manage to not face defeat next week. Regardless, she still is on weak footing. How could this impact negotiations moving forward?
Well, it doesn't help when you have someone who's in a very weak position. Remember, the legislation, once it's got through the Commons, has got to go to the Lords, and I think there will be all sorts of objections and amendments raised there, so that will be a further source of difficulty. So she is in this weak position. On the other hand, I mean, it's very unlikely that she's going to be removed from office because no one can agree on who might be a suitable replacement for her. And of course, if she was removed, that would damage the negotiations even further.
Well, then finally, for perhaps some of our viewers that are not very familiar with all the ins and outs and of these Brexit talks, when you look at where things stand currently, we do know that a holiday break is set for the next coming weeks. Are things headed in the right direction? Could we actually see this happen?
Well, I think things are heading in the right direction. The question is whether we have the time to get through all these complex negotiations and to arrive at a satisfactory deal. And as I said earlier, the whole question of the Irish border remains, I think, a very difficult one to resolve. But certainly this does represent progress. It does give some hope.
Wyn Grant, thank you very much for joining us. We do appreciate it.